Доброго вечора всім.
Good evening. We are happy to welcome you in the Center for Urban History. We are happy to have you tonight. Thank you for joining us. Today we will have a lecture to be held as a part of the lecture series Let's Have a City. Since 2023 we are talking about the experience of modernity in the city. We started off with Lviv. Back in 2023 we talked a lot about Lviv, then we expanded our geography and we moved not only outside Lviv but also outside Galicia. Tonight we will have a chance to get back to Lviv and talk about Lviv, sexuality and modernity. In a minute I will introduce our highly esteemed guest. Just a short admin note. Our lecture is going to be in English. If need be, you can grab a pair of headsets.
Into English. It's my pleasure to present our today's speaker, Michał Narożnak from European University Institute in Florence. Where he is preparing the PhD thesis titled Provincial Perversions, Class, Ethnicity and Cultures of Sexual Knowledge in Lviv and Galicia, 1885-1914. So some of the insights of this thesis, which I explore, was just submitted for defense, will be presented right now, and after we will have the possibility to ask questions and have a discussion. So up to 50 minutes Michał talks, and then we will have the discussion.
Yeah. Let me I just realized that 100 years ago, a Polish person talking in Lviv to a Ukrainian public in English about sexuality would be a really peculiar sight. And I'm Michał. I did my PhD in Florence about sexual knowledge in Lviv in the late Habsburg period. And I touched on many things that I will not talk about today, but I need to mention them as kind of like honorable mentions to paint the landscape of what sexual culture in Galicia at that time was. And perhaps some of these things will be familiar to you, and some of them will be new. And especially one of the first things that intellectuals engage in terms of sexuality in Galicia at that time was this fascination with natural sexuality of the peasantry. Especially that was the case for both Polish and Ukrainian intellectuals. And in terms of Ukrainian work on that, let me go back a little bit. The most incredible kind of product of that fascination is this this collection of ethnographic stories called in German Das Geschlechtsleben des ukrainischen Bauernvolkes in Österreich-Ungarn, which is the sexual life of Ukrainian peasantry in Austria-Hungary, which collects hundreds of erotic stories allegedly told by peasantry to ethnographers. One of the ethnographers, one who submitted his findings, his erotic stories that he collected from the peasantry, was Ivan Franko, and the Ukrainian mind behind this whole collection is Volodymyr Hnatyuk, and it was in two volumes. First was in Russian Empire, Ukrainian peasantry and their sexual life, in Russian Empire, and the second volume was in Austria-Hungary, and they organized it together with this wonderful person who was a sexual ethnographer originally from Croatia, but who lived in Vienna, and who was kind of who established this journal of erotic folklore called Anthropopedia. And it was this collection was intensely studied, for instance, by Sigmund Freud and many other early psychoanalysts. And this kind of idea that there is sexual repression, modernity, modern culture creates this sexual repression, whereas Ukrainian peasantry represents more natural, perhaps lower stage, but in another sense more healthy attitude towards sexuality, more free. That idea came exactly from Ukraine. So the idea of sexual repression in Freudian, its Freudian use is very much in this exchange between Lviv, Galicia and Vienna. Another very important aspect is of Galician sexual culture is the naturalist novels. In Polish, the queen of naturalism was this person, Gabriela Zapolska, who wrote about the exploitation, kind of exposed the exploitation of sexual exploitation of domestic workers in bourgeois houses since the 1880s, right? And these stories all often touch on so-called white slavery narratives, the narratives of human trafficking, right? Of women who are forced to sell themselves to international human traffickers who in Polish culture were often associated with Jewish people, like this person in that painting. This painting actually presents this kind of scene of women forced by poverty to sell herself, and this person has visibly Jewish characteristics, right? It's called the painting is titled "The Devil in the Cafe," and of course that's something that's perhaps most recognizable is masochism, right? You have this kind of tourist trap in the old town of Masoch Cafe or something like that, because Leopold von Sachen-Masoch, the author of the novel Venus in Furs, was from Lviv, right? And in here he set this novel of a Galician nobleman who submits himself fully sexually to a woman called Wanda, right? And that's the plot of the novel. And we can see here drawings by Bruno Schulz, Polish artist and writer from another generation, and we can see that kind of this permanence from Masoch to Bruno Schulz, that this kind of idea was interestingly still connected to Galicia, right? And especially as German nationalists would assign that it is very masochism is a very Slavic thing, right? And Poles would say, no, it's very German, that masochism is inherent to German culture. And so as I said already, masochism is this medical term, and at that time in Austrian Germany we have this boom of sexual science, sexology. It emerges in Vienna, in Berlin, but it's also deeply connected to Galicia, especially as so many, for instance, of early Jewish psychoanalysts came from here. Freud, who's one of the people right on the bottom, his family was from Galicia. Wilhelm Reich, who's also very famous, the person who coined the term sexual revolution, he was from a village on Galician Bukovinian borderland and then studied in Czernowitz, went to high school in Czernowitz. But also Polish people, like the mustache man over there. He was a Polish a follower of Kraft-Ebing forensic medicine school, and he was the first to introduce in Polish language the term uranism, which was the first, before homosexuality was the term for same-sex desire, uranism was used, right? But also homosexuality was first used in Polish language here in Lviv in 1905 in a sexual education magazine that I will later talk about. And another very important thing that's very interesting and we will touch on later is gender bending, especially in Yiddish theater. And we have here two, as they are called, drag kings. So kind of like drag queens, but it is women who impersonate men. And this was very, very popular impersonation style at the beginning of Yiddish theater in Lviv, connected to the group of Jewish folk singers called brother singers. And this is Pepi Littman. I forget right now the name of the other artist, but she's very important because she performed like this to Franz Kafka in Prague. And the third picture is of a woman in kind of female drag. So she doesn't impersonate another gender, but she impersonates kind of a typical woman's role. Okay. So why is that all of this important? Why is sexuality important and studying it? Because it plays a central role in the construction of identity. Through sexuality, persons engage in the process of self-fashioning and self-stylization, shaping both their public performances and the most intimate reflections. It is not merely a private matter, but a way of developing the sense of self. So when we examine how individuals positions and style themselves in relation to the sexual life of the city, we gain insight into the forms of modernity that emerge in that context. We learn what narratives individuals found most productive in shaping their urban experiences, and in turn we might discover what kind of modern entity the city itself becomes. So what kind of modern city Lviv was, or at least how it appeared to those who lived there 120 years ago. To illustrate this point, I will speak of two characters mostly. One is the Berta Kalisz, a Yiddish theater star, and the other, as we will see, is Stanisław Brandowski, Polish tabloid journalist. And both of them, what they have in common because they have actually nothing in common. One grew up working class, poor, Jewish, in the area of Lviv near the old market square, and Stanisław Brandowski was a very posh, educated Polish man, but they both do this thing of sexual flânerie, sexual navigation through the city. They walk, they kind of move around various neighborhoods and various sides of the city, and kind of gain an interesting insights of what the city was. So yeah. So Berta Kalisz is grew up in Lviv, was born in 1874. Became a star of the first Yiddish theater in Lviv, which was Gimpel, Yakov Ber Gimpel Theater. Later, she performed all around Europe, especially in Romania, in Hungary, in Austria. And then she migrated to New York City, and then she made a huge career. And she even played Hamlet. She even played Hamlet in New York Thalia Theater. So we also have this kind of gender crossing in her case, of a female actress playing male role. And in Yiddish theater, in the early days of Yiddish theater created by Abraham Goldfaden, there was no fixed script, but actors and actresses, they impersonated very specific roles. And role of Berta Kalisz was that of a diva. And she never, in every spectacle, Berta Kalisz played a diva. And in her autobiography in Lviv, she still remains in that role. And diva is a female character, one of a number. There's prima donna, there's soubrette, there's the fallen woman. The diva is known for her independence, ambition, and domineering character over men. She's not temperamental. She does not engage in petty feuds with other actresses. She's incredibly talented. Like a pop star of today, Beyonce is best, and yeah, best exemplifying this kind of role. A female version of a hustler, diva is. Because she's also like a businesswoman, right? And so we get this, through this character of a diva, of how she conquers men and their behavior, she presents her experience growing up in Lviv of the 1880s, and describes especially the areas north of the old town, where in the so-called Jewish neighborhood where she grew up. And let us read together just a couple of excerpts of her autobiography, especially those that are, most of them are connected one way or another to sexuality. And this one will be about Sieniawska Street, which is today Ushhorod Street. I made that picture a week ago. I couldn't find but I don't think it changed that much from from the 1880s, right? Okay, and which is a good thing because it's wonderful and the architectural detail is amazing, right? And Sieniawska Street was one of, like Szpitalna Street and few other streets, was the center of prostitution in Lviv. So Berta Kalisz wrote, the red light district, low slung, sunken little houses stood there densely one after another, and the small, black smoking chimneys over them looked like humps. A line of red lights along the street, like a string of beads on an unwashed neck, shone day and night. The trade went on openly with the permission of the police. The merchandise was always displayed in the window or in the doorway. The street presented a strange picture from every cookerel in the window over the length of the street, from both sides, a woman's head. They looked like painted dolls in an exhibit, every face in a grimace, or with a fake smile on its lips. The eye, as thought it had no mission, winked, shelmishly, let's say, to the passers-by. The hair braided, hanging over the shoulders, skin exposed to the waist. The fare never stopped here. There were always customers, and hats pulled down over the eyes. They went through the street, stopping momentarily at the little window, examining, throwing a word, and either went in or kept going. So we can see already a couple of things in that fragment. Is that this street is a little bit romanticized, but there's also, because what follows is that she as a little child got lost there, and she was terrified, and a prostitute came and helped her out to find the way home. So she's a little bit fearful, but also we can see that this is a sort of a stage of an urban spectacle, in which we have, in this kind of weird rendition of Romeo and Juliet, when Juliet is, you know, up there and downstairs is the Romeo, right? So let's remember the three things, kind of like the romanticism, the danger, and making it into a performance. And we basically turn around 180 degrees, and let's read another fragment about what's going on the hill, the high castle, Wysoki Zamek, hill, and what's going on there. The top of the hill was occupied by the butcher boys, because butcher boys, of course, are quite important in the Jewish community, because they provide the kosher meat, right? They have the monopoly for meat trade. The Sabbath daytime belonged to them. They hung around on the hill and conquered it. The girls were quite afraid of them, but despite that, they were ready to commence an acquaintance with them. If a girl pleased this or that butcher boy, he wouldn't waste any time. He approached her, took her by the hand, and pulled her away from her friends. The girl protested, yelled, cursed in German, but she went. Did she have a choice? The butcher boy was stronger than her. So we learn again about how dangerous that there is an openly stated threat of sexual violence embedded in the sexual scripts of Jewish working class youth of that time. But nevertheless, we learn from another fragment that the girls cannot help themselves. but even though their mothers told them not to, they always go to the top of the hill, and and we learn why, because Berta Kalisz in her description does this interesting thing where she takes the danger as a diva, right? There is a danger in woman's life, and she transforms it into the way into a performance in which their roles gets upside down, like she begins to dominate men. And through kind of wonderful, interesting, talented performance. Let's read this fragment. The official language on the hill was German. Not the sort of German that is spoken in Berlin or Vienna, but German. Speaking Yiddish somehow didn't fit. Polish was a little too difficult, so we had to speak German. That was the intellectual language, and mostly girls utilized it. They wanted to impress the boys with their German. It was their entire dowry. The uglier a girl was, the more German she spoke. Heine, Goethe, and Schiller was always on her lips. The air of the hill was full of Lorelei. So, using a language perceived as sophisticated allowed them to conjure, the woman on the hill, to conjure an alternative worldly persona. Speaking German was another form of impersonation, so Kalisz revealed how young women could creatively participate in the events on the hill. The German poem that Berta Kalisz referenced cannot be accidental. Heine's Lorelei was a siren who killed sailors with her song. She sat on a hill, and they crashed into the rocks below. Kalisz symbolically shifted from being prey to predator through invoking the power of female performance. This move brought her pleasure, or, to use her word, happiness, as she enjoyed the erotic dynamic of Heine's poem, where a woman embodied divine beauty and power. By combining fantasy and realism, she legitimized her authority as a diva. And Kalisz at certain points begins to leave the Jewish neighborhood and goes to the more posh parts of town. One of them is the Jesuit garden. Just as the butcher boys occupied the primary place on that hill, the students had the primary place in the garden. Girls from the better classes grouped themselves around the students. Normally, they arrived in the company of their mothers, but these were smart mothers. As soon as the student approached the girl to greet her, the mother suddenly became tired and sat down on a bench to rest. In the meantime, the young courtier had a chance to walk with the daughter until the time came to go home. Then he brought her back to the mother and accompanied them both home. So she engages here also, as in a spectacle with a clear. This explains us what's going on in the park as a clear choreography. The man approaches, the mother sits down, they have a walk, right? Because she's an actress, she uses that style of description. But she also engages in this interesting inter-ethnic comparison, or intertwine ethnic/class, in which butcher boys who exemplify working class sexual customs, scripts, they are very to the point of violence. They are very physical, and nothing is kind of hidden repressed, right? And here, there's no violence, which Berta Kalisz greatly appreciates, but there's sort of cynicism of the game, right? There's this woman, the middle-class woman, the mother, they want the best party, the best cavalier, as Berta Kalisz said it, for her daughter. So you exchange a sort of honesty for violence, violence for honesty, right? That's the kind of a transaction. Great. We are on time. And then finally, Berta Kalisz, and it will be a really problematic quote, which is great, as how she becomes a sexual actor herself, right? At the 11 years of age, you must know, Berta Kalisz, she uses third person here about herself, was already a person among people. At that time, she was sent by her family to be a part of a musical school, what's it called? Never mind. The musical school in Lviv, which was Polish, and in south of the center. So she had to cross through the city center to get there. A person among people. Her hair was combed differently. They sewed different dresses for her, and she looked different. And when I used to walk on the promenade, gentlemen looked at me. Officers and students nearly devoured me with their eyes. I had many admirers. Do you think that I used to look back at them? Oh no, I went my own way with my eyes straight ahead, but with my heartbeat rose from time to time when I felt the eyes of these elegant gentlemen upon me. I was afraid of them, but I could not, and perhaps did not want to, free myself of the pleasant trembling that a person feels when they are being admired. To be truthful, I always loved admiration, says about 11-year-old girl. So we understand where the diva comes from. Like the diva, the figure of the diva is is a response developed for dangers, the threat of sexual violence she faces in the city, of being catcalled, or by the butcher boys who basically, you know, have their way with the girls on the hill. But through this performance, and this is quite exceptional, and of course it doesn't excuse male behavior, but that she finds pleasure in that role, right? So in that sense, she has a quite ordinary biography of a Jewish girl. Then during this boom of cultural, popular culture and education boom, where Jewish women were often sent to let's say Christian schools in another part of town to get a better lay education. But on the other hand, because she plays this important role in the Jewish community, one that allows her to voice this experience, but she needs to put it in this frame that she knows of theater. So that's why I titled this urban spectacle, right? And here we have our next character, who's, well, who is he? We will see, because he's interesting. I couldn't find a picture of him because he's not well known, he's not exceptional, he in any way. He's just a tabloid journalist, one of many. His name was Stanisław Brandowski, and he was really an enthusiast of prostitution, and we will see why. He starts in Lviv as a tabloid journalist, and he is the one responsible from stories from town. So whenever there's an anecdote, right, about what happened on the street the given day, he's the one responsible for that section of an evening newspaper called Wiek Nowy, New Century, right? So he presents this kind of cast of characters that he hangs out with, like gamblers or Kabbalah fortune tellers, or he presents in another article a guy named Pharaoh who owns like a pub for homeless people. So this kind of stories is his collecting this kind of stories is his job. One of his friends he also writes about is Gitla, my old friend, who used to be a mixed trader, but later, due to rheumatism, opened a brothel on Sępska, right? And he engages in this liberal style of writing, because it's mostly Jewish spaces also, right? Engages in this Polish, a little anti-Semitic way of writing about the Jewish spaces in a way that's kind of orientalized. Focusing on backwardness of religious orthodoxy, combined with prostitution, combined with neglect of children, and children just like walk around freely. And so that's this guy, that's his job. And then in 1905, in Lviv, a first sexual education magazine begins to be published. It is called Świat Płciowy, which can be translated as sexual world, like Geschlecht is sexual, like it's sexual world, and it had a really short life because it was so outrageous that it was closed due to like sheer outlandishness of many claims that were made, especially by Brandowski, as we will see. But it is still, nevertheless, this magazine holds a relevance in Polish culture because, for instance, it is the first one to write about homosexuality, and it did it in like 5 articles, mostly sympathetic and sensationalizing. One is like the story of this lesbian club in London, that was called the Sappho Club, and that gathered like aristocratic ladies who engaged in this kind of behavior and later committed suicide together. But they also like published reasonable research on homosexuality, like what Magnus Hirschfeld was doing in Berlin. So, and if we had in Berta Kalisz there was this pattern of description of there's a threat in the city, let's imagine it as a performance and then dominate it. In Brandowski and Świat Płciowy, this pattern of description is like, let's find something sensational and then present reasonable data on that thing. Well, let's see it. So Brandowski, how does he describe himself and what he's doing? Because in Świat Płciowy he started a long-running series of articles about prostitution in Lviv, that he continued in his own, he began to publish his own newspaper just to publish the rest of his findings on Lviv prostitution after Świat Płciowy, sexual world, was closed. And he begins like that. Countless evening, instead of sitting in theater at home or in another spiritually suitable company, I prefer to spend the evenings in the most random taverns, in basements or attics, among the destitute in penny lodging houses, among drunks who only roam the city's outskirts at night. For the poverty of some evoked in me the deepest compassion, while the depravity of others aroused curiosity, which then led me to spend time among simple natures, free from falsehood. I am deeply convinced that even 30 years spent in police and judicial service would not have given me the familiarity with pauperism and criminality in Lviv that I gained from just a few immersions in the most significant dens of Lviv's misery, in those infamous taverns and dives where I met guests unlike any other. So yeah, so he begins like this, his articles on prostitutions, and what follows is a couple of anecdotes he gathered, like his misadventures in the city. Once, for instance, he was convinced that there is a brothel on the Rynek Square, on the main square, right? And he stalked it like a police detective would, and then he saw that there are actually bourgeois ladies that come into this establishment, so he thought it's an illegal abortion clinic. He employed a prostitute, a friend of his, to kind of go inside and see what's going on there. But she was turned around, so he finally went in, and the woman opened the door for him and confessed that this place, what she does there for bourgeois women, is reconstruct of virginity and improbable stories. Or another time, he's in the Jesuit garden in nowadays even Franko Park, and he overhears two little girls saying that we have this secret and we should not tell this secret to anybody. And it turned out, and he follows them through around the city to another park and then to their apartments. And he hires a person to also stake out the place. And it turns out that because he is convinced that this is child trafficking ring, and that he just discovered. And it turns out that they work in an illegal cigarette manufacturer when the little girls roll cigarettes. So yeah, so he has this kind of very commercial attitude towards the city. Like, people go to theater to have this commercial entertainment. I go to brothels, but not to have sex, or maybe, no, he also has sex there, but he also like investigates the sociology of prostitute. And in his articles he, as you can see, provides photos of the women engaged in sex trade. And this group of women is a group waiting in front of the police building for weekly checkups that the legalized prostitute needed to have every week. And in them, on the other side, we have two pictures that kind of exemplify what he sees as a career of a Lviv prostitute, of going from wearing a scarf that is the scarf is an artifact of a rural woman, right? Rural women wear scarves, so where young women are migrating from rural areas to the city, they still wear scarves, and then they get money. Eventually they join the sex trade, and then they start wearing the metropolitan clothes, like wearing a hat. So from scarf to hat is the symbol of the prostitute's career in his idea. So it's like exemplified on commodities. He romanticizes and sensationalizes prostitutes. One is a photo of a drunken prostitute, the other is pimp robbing the prostitute of her earnings, which is obviously stage photo, right, in the news, because obviously the technology did not allow to like randomly take pictures of stuff on the street. Okay, yeah, and then he begins to turn all this observation of prostitutes and all those anecdotes into statistics. So, and he believes that his statistics are far superior to those of the police because prostitutes know him. He's their friend, and they lie to the police. So he interviews, I don't remember how many prostitutes he interviewed, but it's around 200 or something, 180. And he provides a number of data, right? Reasons for joining the sex trade in Lviv. And while it's not the best way to present this statistic, but he believes that they lie to the police that it is the poverty that made them join the ranks of sex trade, right, in the city. But he tells us that it is family ostracism that is the real issue. Family ostracism is when, in the end, your parents or your family or your stepfather, stepmother forces you in one way or another to join the ranks of prostitution. And obviously, prostitutes, he tells us, would never say that to the police because they are not snitches, they don't snitch on anybody. So, he says that police also categorizes excessive sex drive. It is because of scientific culture of that time that women are joining prostitutes because they have excessive sex drive, right? And he finds that they are not. They don't have excessive sex drive. For some reason, he does not find it believable. And he says that they try to save money, but none of them can, because he says they are women and they like shopping. So they always spend money immediately on new clothes, right? Another statistic is that of age group of prostitutes in Lviv, and it reflects the pattern of migrating from the countryside to the city at around 15, then joining domestic workforce, housemaids, house servants, and cooks, and so on, and then in like 3 or 4 years, switching from domestic work to sex work, and then performing sex work for around, let's say, 7 years, and then leaving the city. So if nobody, as he presents, the reasons for quitting sex trade, leaving the city is the only way, and we can see also that previous profession of women entering sex trade, vast majority is domestic worker, right? And we have a bookbinder section here. It is very specific, he tells us, to that year, because there was a prolonged strike of bookbinders that forced many women in 1905 to join, for women who worked previously as in print shops, to join sex work because they had no other way of sustaining themselves. So Brandowski exemplified this modernist capitalist culture in which the prostitutes reflected the growing commodification of social and cultural relations as an inseparable form or from other urban occurrences. Prostitute figure is so important to this commercialization is because she, as Walter Benjamin puts it, she's a saleswoman and wears in one. So, and that's why this kind of modernity that emerges in Lviv is capitalist modernity, with that shapes consumerist attitude. And we can see that Lviv shared this poor but sexy image in Brandowski's text, in the sense that it could not compete with Vienna, or perhaps, well, with grandeur of palaces or of the opera house, but on the level of the lowbrow popular entertainment of which sex trade was a part, it very much could compete with any other European city. So it's kind of like we made this comparison with Vienna, obviously, as the capital, but also as the capital of this vulgar urban entertainment. Lviv is much more similar to Budapest. And so, what's the point? What's the modernity in Lviv that emerges in those narratives of both Berta Kalisz and Stanisław Brandowski? Maybe it sounds simple, but it is the same modernity as in London or in Paris. In Lviv, the similar urban actors emerge. And the same narratives of a privileged male spectator who can conquer anything, and of a woman who, despite dangers in store for her, does the same. So there's emancipation, there's capitalism. So it's not a Central European experience. It's just ordinary, perhaps it's exceptional, but in the other way, in another sense, an ordinary European experience with modernity that we find here. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. I open the floor for the questions, and while you are thinking, my first question will be about sources.
Yeah.
On the example you mentioned, Berta Kalisz and Stanisław Brandowski,
yeah.
So you use two kinds of sources, right? Like celebrity tell-all style autobiography written by Kalisz in her 50s,
Yeah.
in 1920s. So
yeah.
looking back on her life and creating, constructing some story of her life, right? It's the first source. And another source is actually tabloid-style newspaper article created for audience interested in such kind of sensations, gossip, city life. So my question is, how do you deal with the limitations of your sources? And how, and what kind of methodology you use to unpack those sources and to find the research interpretations?
Yeah, so in a sense, her autobiography was also, Galicia's biography was also printed in a newspaper, and they both kind of similarly, they engage in kind of this tabloid performance of telling the unadulterated story of she, of course, from the perspective of the agent, he doesn't, but in the end, celebrity tello and exposition of the real life, honest representation of the city in all its sins is the same, is two sides of the same tabloid, perhaps I use sometimes the word populist way of talking about sexuality. And my point is that it is the most prevalent narrative of European modernity that, as we know it, that it often presents itself as the manifestation of true and honest experience, and that it is very limited because it's this kind of way of talking about it is obviously a performance, but that's my point, right? That's my point to kind of investigate this style of talking about sexuality, and it's the self-stylizations that are involved, and how because I don't study the real experience of Lviv prostitutes, or sexual scripts. I don't do social history. I actually look exactly on how it's employed in the authors, in the ways the author shapes himself through it. So, as a source for social history, it's terrible, both, in my opinion. In terms of how they present themselves, it's great. Yeah, that's my kind of the answer. Okay.
Thank you for. So thank you for sharing your findings. I have 3 questions, so the first one, I was interested if you inspected and you researched while doing the topic, the intersection of coloniality and sexuality within the topic, and it's because the first slide was mentioning this idea of natural sexuality for the peasantry, and both Ukrainian and Polish peasantry, and it reminded me of how colonized subjects were usually objectified and sexualized by the groups in power. So colonization and objectification and sexualization were really entangled, and I was wondering if you noticed this intersection in your research. The second one was just a fun thing that crossed my mind when we were reading out the Berta Kalisz's autobiography, is that it really reminded me of a genre of erotica, like Anna is Me, for example, and I was interested whether you noticed these similarities, because I think that, as you mentioned, this text is performative in some cases, and it was just interesting to notice the similarities for me. And the last question was, it tackles around on the definition of sexuality, because from what I know in different historical periods, the main challenge for studying sexuality is what sexuality actually is and was for that particular period. Like, for example, in medieval studies, there is a debate that like scholars usually confuse sexuality and heterosexuality in particular with performing gender roles, and they presume that this or that act is heterosexual while it is actually about performing gender roles. And so I was wondering whether there were any challenges like connected to the definition of sexuality, and maybe the fact that in like right now we already have this whole baggage of knowledge and images around sexuality, and maybe how it also I don't know, interacts with your topic.
Right, great questions. Let me answer the second one first, because the answer is shortest. I don't know it, and maybe we can talk later and you can point me to more details about it. In terms of coloniality, well, I want to avoid the discussion about coloniality of Galicia right now because it's a huge topic, and I don't know if you would agree. I don't believe in Austria-Hungary it's a right framework, but very much in this construction of the sexuality of the peasantry and perceived as natural, it is important because some globally created structured narratives are present, and you can read, maybe you know this work is Global History of Sexual Sciences, I think, and they often mention what is called an unruly appropriation of colonialist discourse in colonials by people who are indigenous to colonial spaces, right? And this is also the case of that we present, we agree on kind of on these patterns of development that perhaps Western Europe is more highly developed, but we say it developed wrongly, and we have a chance through observation of, for instance, the life and work, the sexual life of Ukrainian peasantry, to find a new kind of modernity. So there is an agreement that yes, maybe they are perhaps a little more, even more primitive, yes. They wouldn't hesitate to use that word. But they are healthier, and they allow us to overcome the shortcomings of what we can see in Western modernity. So in that case, the Ukrainian, Ukrainian experience with modernity is very different. So contrary to what I said in the beginning, in this kind of comparison between East and West, right? West repressed and therefore unhealthy, and Ukraine free and therefore healthy and positively transformative in the future. And the third question, what is sexuality? Well, not every gender role are inherent to studying sexuality. Sexuality isn't perhaps to all studies of all gender performances, but no, you cannot, in sexuality you have to look at gender lens all the time. But what is, because unlike the modern, unlike medieval, is just, I can define sexuality as this modern invention, this modern narrative, the modern discourse on sex. That's what sexuality is the modern organized way of talking about sex. That's what sexuality is. So it's kind of like nationalism is sexuality, and ethnic feelings of ethnicity is sex. Like, one is the narrative above, superstructure, right? Sexuality is a superstructure over sex. That's it. Maybe we can talk later. Yeah.
More questions?
Yeah, thank you for your lecture. It was very enlightening. And I had a question about, you had the Jewish characters and you have Polish authors. And do you see, and you spoke about discourse on sexual violence and how do we perceive that Slavs are masochist or Germans are masochist. Do you see this racialized discourse toward Jews in your...
In that case, in the case of masochism, surprisingly, I was expecting to find it immediately. And I don't know why it does not appear. It feels so obvious to me, knowing a lot of anti-Semitic narratives, that it should appear, but it doesn't. And even with Bruno Schulz, who is of Jewish descent, right? It doesn't. It's very interesting. Why? I don't know why. It should be there, but it's not. It's because of Sacher Masoch himself, who pointed to the Slavs as a source, and to the Slavic peasantry, and his nanny as one character. Or in 1846, he witnessed the Galician slaughter, and he saw allegedly a peasant woman whipping a nobleman, right? I don't know if you're familiar with, it's important hugely for Polish memory of Galicia, the slaughter of 1846, right? I don't know if it's the same in Ukraine. So yeah, so this, because he himself associated that, so all the German biographers and experts who analyzed it associated that with Slavic race, not the Jewish. And the Poles just responded as, no, it's not us, it's you guys who are like this. Yeah.
Ваша лекція викликає дуже багато запитань, чесно кажучи.
I don't hear it, sorry. It should work, I don't know. Yes.
Кажу, ваша лекція викликає дуже багато запитань, але я вас не буду стомлювати цими запитаннями, а хочу з'ясувати тільки таку річ. У тому суспільстві роль церкви була надзвичайно більша навіть ніж на сьогоднішній день. І як відомо, католицька, греко-католицька церква не могла толерувати таке явище, як проституція. А як до цього ставилась синагога? От виникає питання.
That's just not factually correct, actually, which is a surprising thing that I also found. That because
тобто церква толерувала проституцію?
So, in Austria-Hungary, the law was that prostitution is legal. And the church sustained that system of legal prostitution because they believed. That's a great thing about Christianity, that you can be sinful. So you tolerate a degree of sin. You have to confess later on. And of course, it's incredibly immoral. But in the end, prostitution, how they saw it, I don't want to be disrespectful to anybody. Prostitution is thanks to prostitution, men don't commit more violent sins. I don't know how to say it. It's a question of creating one outlet so bigger immorality is not created. But the church, as we know the church now, that speaks a lot, both Catholic, Greek Catholic and Roman Catholic, speaks a lot about sex, right? But that's not the case in 19th century. The church did not yet focused on that. It was, you have to come to confess your sins, but otherwise, shush, we don't talk about it. That was the strategy, the kind of the church consensus.
А як щодо синагоги?
The same, yeah, the same.
Добре. В своїй доповіді ви назвали Львів столицею проституції. Європейської проституції. Хто був на другому і на третьому місці? Після Львова. Одну хвилинку. Але тим не менше, скільки у Львові було будинків терпимості, хто їх отримав і хто керував цим процесом, бо це великий бізнес був.
Okay, I was a little too sensational. Lviv was the second most immoral city in Europe, and the first one was Budapest. I think we should also mention Odessa, Warsaw, and Italian cities, Naples and Genova especially, the port cities of Italy, right? Because the most important story is that of what is called white slavery, of moving women. Historians now try to see it as also voluntary migration of women for prostitution from European cities to South America. So Buenos Aires should also be mentioned in that story. And in terms of brothels, not every prostitute was in a brothel. There were brothel prostitutes and street prostitutes. How many we don't know. There were 400 legal but prostitutes that were recognized by the government as such, but there were countless others. Brandowski actually say that all working class women engage in one way or another in some sort of transactional sexual relationship. But in terms of brothels, how many were there? They were owned by mostly Jewish women in the north of the city, in the northern suburbs. In the street is exactly like Sieniawska, and Szpitalna is another. I don't know what's the name, current name of Szpitalna Street. And it's the same? Okay. And it came from the north to the city center to what is now Lesia Ukrainka Street, Serbska Street, and if the brothel could open on the main square as well, but it would face the building of the mayoral building, so it was not that well seen. And where we are now, less. This was the fancy part of town, and it was, and with it was the zone of the street prostitutes. So here, in what, especially Akademicka Street, so now Prospect Shevchenki, right? And around George Hotel, there were a lot of prostitutes who on the streets in better clothes and who would engage in, you know, who would say, I'm a widow, I'm new to town, can you help me out? Brandowski explained this kind of strategies. He's fascinated by those strategies, actually. And of course, the railway station was also a huge center of prostitution. Also not brothel prostitution, yeah. That's it.
Actually, we have quite a few books written on prostitution in Galicia, and we have them in our library, so if you would like to know more, you are very welcome. Do we have more questions? Comments? I have, like in continuation of what Asa said about sexuality, I actually had a question about it the same as well. Do you think that your interpretation of sexuality of Fin-de-Siècle Lviv is, and your impact on, or your influence on the high matter of sexuality, of self to sexuality, so it was very important for self in many ways. Do you think it's more high modernity evaluation of sexuality that we are using or might use now than it's the reality of that time, Fin-de-Siècle Lviv, of sexuality? Do the sexuality meant the same for the self at that time that it meant today?
I think so. I think so. I think they were faced, but they were faced with many similar questions to ours. But for instance, about commercialization of sex, about sex being more and more present in everyday experience, and some people, you know, people react to that differently then and now, that some people are fascinated by how much we talk about sex, and some people are lost in that, and they are perhaps more, you know, more vulnerable and want to keep that things private. So this kind of tension between let's make it public or let's keep it intimate, it's the same. Your question is quite broad, so I don't know if I can answer it perfectly. You want to have something specific in mind also?
No, I just wondering how do you explain sexuality and the self and meaning of sexuality to the self, like to the person of that time? Do you think you mixed our today's interpretation of sexuality and that time?
Do I mix it? No, I don't. I hope not. I hope not. At least, yes, I hope not. I was astonished of how much people talked about it, and how much they did fashion themselves around those topics, and about, especially because prostitution was such an incredibly important issue, and that every man would, let's say, lose their virginity, would experience their first time with a prostitute. That was such a quintessential experience for the self that I don't think I am kind of making this presentist claim of assigning too much importance to that. No, I don't think so. There's just so much sources, and so like that. I think my approach is arguably it is reasonable, and has a base in sources.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation, for this conversation. Я запрошую вас на нашу наступну подію, яка відбудеться.
Our next event is going to be held tomorrow. You are very welcome to join. From exotic plant to the symbol of modern culture, the brief history of sunflower in Ukraine. So that will be the representative from Australia, Irina Skobi from Melbourne University. So we will be happy to have you tomorrow. Have a peace.